All right, so we're diving deep into Malachi 3, 8-10 today. And I know you're probably thinking, wait a minute, I've heard a million sermons on this one. But stick with us. This is about finding those hidden gems, those fresh perspectives that'll really make your congregation think.
It's like a master class in approaching this verse.
Exactly. We're going beyond the obvious with the help of pastors.ai. We've analyzed sermons from 5 different churches: the Embassy Center, Gateway Church, Harvest Church, OK, First Baptist Newport, and Abundant Life Church.
And what's amazing is how each one tackled this idea of robbing God. It gets way deeper than just tithing.
Yeah, right off the bat, that question, will a mere mortal rob God? It's kind of provocative, right? What jumped out at you and how these pastors interpreted that?
Well, for me, it was less about avoiding punishment and more about what we're missing out on. Like First Baptist Newport, they really focused on the relational aspect. They were saying that withholding tithes isn't just about the church's finances, it's about our personal relationship with God.
So it's like a measure of how much we actually rely on God.
Exactly. Not just with our words, but with our wallets too. They even brought up Martin Luther. He said there are 3 conversions for a Christian: the heart, the mind, and the wallet. It's like you can't say you've surrendered everything if your finances are still off limits.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so that's a pretty intimate way to look at it. But then you've got Gateway Church taking this, like, way more combative approach.
Right. They framed tithing as spiritual warfare. They connected it back to Adam and Eve's sin, taking what belonged to God. Their whole point was that if we withhold our tithes, we're repeating that same act of disobedience. We're opening a door to the enemy.
Well, okay. So if not tithing is like the fall, does that mean every financial decision becomes this spiritual battle?
That's what's so interesting about their interpretation, right? It really raises the stakes.
Yeah.
Suddenly, budgeting isn't just about being practical, it's about aligning yourself with God's will.
So are we supposed to be constantly fighting temptation with every dollar?
Well, not necessarily. Remember the Embassy Center? They talked about breaking generational curses through financial faithfulness. For them, tithing is a way to shift from a scarcity mindset to one of abundance. And that impacts not just us, but future generations too.
So it's not just about battling temptation, it's about breaking free from this whole mentality of lack.
Exactly. And that actually connects really well with what Harvest Church OK was saying. They talked about believers being windows of heaven, not just receiving blessings, but being conduits for them.
That's a cool image. So instead of praying for God to open the windows, we become the windows ourselves.
It flips the script, right? And it makes you think it's not just about money, it's about how much of your time, your skills, your everything do you offer back to God.
So Malachi 3, 8-10 becomes like this springboard to examine our whole lives, not just finances.
Exactly. It's about this holistic surrender, reflecting our trust in God through everything we do. And that actually brings us to something really crucial that was woven through all of these sermons: the historical context.
Oh, right. We can't forget that Malachi was talking to a specific group of people at a specific time. What were some of the key historical insights that came up?
So Malachi was prophesying around 400 BC. After the Israelites had returned from exile, they were rebuilding, there was this revival happening, but they were still struggling with commitment. And their offerings were like a reflection of their hearts. Malachi was calling them out for not giving their best.
That adds another layer to robbing God, doesn't it? It's not just about keeping money, it's about holding back our best in every area.
And this wasn't some new concept either. Tithing goes way back, even before the Mosaic Law. Remember Abraham tithing to Melchizedek in Genesis? This isn't just a rule, it's a principle woven throughout Scripture.
So it's got this timeless relevance for us today. But let's be real, sometimes these concepts need a little something extra to really stick with people. What were some of the most compelling illustrations you found in the pastors.ai data?
Oh, there were some good ones. The Embassy Center used this great analogy. They compared having a scarcity mindset to those people who pile their plates sky high at a Golden Corral buffet. Like they're afraid there won't be enough, even though there's tons of food.
Yeah, I get it. It's funny, but it makes you think, how often do we operate with that same fear, even when it comes to giving back to God?
Right. And then there's this one anecdote from Verity Church Media that was brilliant. It was about this Subway promotion where if you donated a can of food, you'd get a free sandwich.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
Well, these teenagers figured out they could buy the cheapest canned goods possible, like a can of beans for 25 cents, and then get a sub that was worth way more. And Verity Church connected that to the Israelites, giving the bare minimum while expecting maximum blessings in return, like a transactional approach to faith instead of true devotion.
Ouch, that one kind of stings, doesn't it? It's like, are we trying to game the system with God?
It really makes you examine your motives. Are we giving our best or just trying to get away with the bare minimum?
Okay, so we've got fear-driven giving and bargain basement faith. What other illustrations stood out?
Abundant Life Church used a really interesting visual. They talked about the world's largest window frame in Dubai.
Oh, I've seen pictures of that thing. It's massive.
Right. Well, their point was that the size of our giving, whether it's time, talent, or treasure, determines the size of the blessings we receive. If you give through a tiny window, you get a trickle of blessing. But if you give generously, it's like that massive Dubai window frame, blessings pouring in.
I love that. It's such a simple concept, but it really drives home the point.
It's not just about giving something, it's about giving generously, wholeheartedly, with that spirit of abundance.
And speaking of abundance, one church really emphasized the impact that our giving can have on future generations. The Embassy Center.
Right, their whole focus on breaking generational curses through financial faithfulness adds a whole other dimension. It's not just about our personal blessings, but about the legacy we leave behind.
So by being faithful stewards, we're not just managing our own finances, we're potentially breaking cycles of poverty and lack that have been plaguing families for generations.
That's the idea. It's a profound responsibility, and it elevates the act of giving to something far greater than just a personal transaction.
It ties back into the idea of stewardship we talked about earlier, right? It's not just about giving away money, it's about managing all of our resources wisely and responsibly. Everything we have, our time, our talents, our possessions, it all ultimately belongs to God. And we're called to be faithful stewards of those resources.
Exactly. And that stewardship, that generosity, it has the power to transform lives, to break chains, to leave a legacy that extends far beyond our own lifetime.
Okay, so we've laid this deep theological and historical foundation. Now I'm curious to hear more about how these pastors actually apply these concepts to the lives of their congregations. How do they bridge the gap between theory and practice?
Well, one of the most striking things that emerged from the pastors' AI data was the emphasis on gratitude. It's easy to get caught up in the mechanics of giving that we forget the heart posture behind it.
Oh, that's so true. We can get so focused on the how much and the to whom that we lose sight of the why.
Right. And gratitude is the key. When we're truly grateful for all that God has done for us, it naturally flows out in generosity. It's like saying, "Thank you, God, for all you've given me. Here's a small token of my appreciation."
And that gratitude shouldn't be limited to just our finances, right? It should permeate every area of our lives.
Absolutely. We should be grateful for our health, our families, our opportunities, even our struggles. And that gratitude will naturally lead us to live generously, not just with our money, but with our time, our talents, and our loves.
Okay, so we've got gratitude as a foundation, but let's be honest, sometimes people need a little extra motivation. What were some of the most effective calls to action you saw in these sermons?
One that really stood out to me was from First Baptist Newport. They emphasized the joy of giving. They reminded their congregation that giving shouldn't feel like a burden, it should be a delight.
It's easy to get bogged down in the duty or the obligation, but when we actually experience that joy, it changes everything.
It really does. And that joy is contagious, It inspires others to give and creates this whole culture of generosity that just spreads.
So instead of guilt-tripping people into giving, it's about inviting them into the joy of partnering with God in his mission of love and redemption.
Exactly. And one thing that's often overlooked is the connection between giving and spiritual growth. They go hand in hand.
Oh, that's interesting. How do these pastors link generosity to spiritual maturity?
It all comes down to trust. When we give generously, it requires us to trust God in a very real, tangible way. We're saying, "God, I believe you will provide for my needs, even when I give away a portion of what I have."
It's like we're exercising our faith muscles.
Exactly. And just like any muscle, the more we use it, the stronger it becomes. That growth in faith then spills over into every area of our lives, our relationships, our work, our decision-making.
So it's not just about giving money. It's about growing in our dependence on God and experiencing his faithfulness in a very real way.
You got it. It's about becoming more Christ-like in our character, more selfless in our actions, and more trusting in our hearts.
And that brings us to a really powerful concept that several of the churches addressed: legacy. What do they have to say about the long-term impact of our giving?
Well, it's not just about the immediate impact. It's about the ripples that extend far beyond our own lifetime. When we give generously, we're investing in God's kingdom in a way that will continue to bear fruit long after we're gone.
So it's not just about our own personal blessing. It's about leaving a legacy of faith and generosity for future generations.
That's it. It's about being part of something bigger than ourselves, something that will outlive us and continue to make a difference in the world.
It's like planting a seed that grows into this mighty tree, providing shade and shelter for generations to come.
I love that analogy. And when we view generosity through that lens, it takes on a whole new level of significance. It's no longer just about what we can get, it's about what we can give, what we can leave behind.
It's about making a difference that will echo throughout eternity. And speaking of making a difference, one thing that really struck me in these sermons was the emphasis on risk. True generosity often involves stepping outside our comfort zones.
Absolutely. When we give, we're letting go of something we perceive as ours, and we're trusting that God will provide. It's an act of faith.
And that's where the real growth happens, right? When we
Right.
choose to trust God, even when it feels risky.
Exactly. And the Bible is full of stories of people who took risks for God. Think of Abraham leaving his homeland, Moses confronting Pharaoh, David facing Goliath. They all stepped out in faith, trusting that God would be with them.
And their obedience and generosity led to incredible breakthroughs and blessings, not just for themselves, but for generations to come. It's inspiring, isn't it?
It really is. And it reminds us that true generosity isn't about playing it safe. It's about taking that leap of faith and trusting that God will catch us. It's about embracing the adventure of partnering with God in his grand story of redemption.
Okay, so we've got risk, gratitude, stewardship, spiritual warfare, generational impact. It's clear that Malachi 3:8-10 is so much more than just a verse about money.
It's a call to examine every area of our lives and to give our best to God, trusting that he will bless us abundantly.
It's a challenge to live a life of radical generosity, to reflect God's abundance in everything we do, and to trust that he will always provide for his children. But before we get too carried away, let's take a break and come back for part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into the practical applications of these concepts and how we can bring them to life in our ministries.
You know, as we're unpacking all these different interpretations, one theme that keeps coming up is this idea of holy. It's not just about giving money, it's about giving something set apart, dedicated to God's purposes.
Yeah, Gateway Church really hit on that when they were talking about the tithe being holy. But what does that even look like practically? I mean, does it actually change how we approach giving?
Think about your own giving for a second. Do you treat it like something special, something set apart? Or is it just another line item in your budget? The concept of holy, it elevates giving. It's more than just a transaction. It becomes an act of worship. It's acknowledging that God is in control of everything.
That actually makes me think about those teenagers and that Subway promotion we talked about earlier. I mean, their offering wasn't exactly holy, was it? It was more like a loophole.
Exactly. It was like they were trying to trick God, which brings us back to Malachi's question, right? Will a mere mortal rob God? Are we just trying to get away with the bare minimum? Or are we really honoring God with our first and best?
So how do we cultivate that heart of giving? That genuine generosity. It's easy to say, give more. But how do we move people from obligation to actually wanting to give?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing where all of our blessings come from. It's not about how hard we work or how smart we are. It's about God's grace. And once we really grasp that, letting go becomes a lot easier.
It's like saying, God, you gave me all this, so I'm going to trust you with this part. But this goes way beyond finances, right? We talked about time, talents.
Oh, absolutely. It's about looking at our resources, our time, our skills, our passions, and asking ourselves, how can I use these to bless others, to advance God's kingdom? What is God passionate about? What breaks his heart? Those are the areas where we can make a real difference.
So it's not just about writing a check. It's about seeing the world through God's eyes and finding those opportunities to make a difference where he cares most.
You got it. And that takes a discernment, prayer, and a willingness to step outside of our comfort zones. Speaking of stepping outside of comfort zones, we talked about risk earlier, but I think it's worth diving a little deeper.
Yeah, the idea of risk in giving can be a tough pill to swallow, especially when people are already struggling financially. How did these pastors address that tension?
Well, several of them emphasize the principle of sowing and reaping, and not in a prosperity gospel kind of way, but recognizing that when we sow generously, we reap generously. It's a spiritual principle, not a formula.
It's about trusting that God will honor our obedience and provide for us, even when we step out in faith and give sacrificially. But it's not always about those big, flashy donations, is it?
No, not at all. Abundant Life Church really highlighted the power of small acts of generosity. It's not about the amount, it's about the heart behind it, like the widow's mite in the Bible. It was a tiny amount, but she gave it sacrificially, and it spoke volumes about her faith.
So it's about creating a lifestyle of generosity, right? Looking for those everyday opportunities to bless others, no matter how small.
Exactly. It's about those small acts of kindness, those seemingly insignificant moments that can actually have a ripple effect far beyond what we imagine. A kind word, a helping hand, listening ear, these can be just as impactful as a financial gift.
So we've talked about gratitude, risk, the power of small acts. But let's be real. Sometimes people need a little extra push. What were some of the most effective calls to action that you saw in these sermons?
One that really stuck with me was First Baptist Newport's focus on the joy of giving. They reminded their congregation that giving shouldn't feel like a burden, it should be a delight.
It's so easy to get bogged down in the duty or the obligation, but when we actually experience that joy, it changes everything.
You're so right. And that joy, it's contagious. It inspires others to give, and it creates this culture of generosity that spreads like wildfire.
So instead of guilt-tripping people into giving, it's about inviting them into the joy of partnering with God in his mission of love and redemption.
Beautifully said. And you know, another thing that's often overlooked is the connection between giving and our own spiritual growth. They go hand in hand.
Oh, that's an interesting link.
hmm
How did these pastors connect generosity to spiritual maturity?
It all comes back to trust. When we give generously, we have to trust God in a really tangible way. We're basically saying, God, I believe that you will provide for my needs, even when I give away some of what I have.
It's like working out our faith muscles.
Exactly. And just like any muscle, the more we use it, the stronger it gets. That growth in faith then overflows into every part of our lives. Our relationships, our work, our decisions.
So it's not just about giving money. It's about growing in our reliance on God and seeing his faithfulness in action.
Exactly. It's about becoming more like Christ in our character, more selfless in our actions, and more trusting in our hearts.
That reminds me of a powerful concept that a lot of the churches touched on,
Mm.
legacy. What do they say about the long-term impact of our giving?
It's not just about the immediate effect, it's about the ripple effects that go way beyond our lifetime. When we give generously, we're investing in God's kingdom in a way that'll keep bearing fruit long after we're gone.
So it's not just about our own personal blessing. It's about leaving a legacy of faith and generosity for the next generation.
Exactly. It's about being part of something so much bigger than ourselves, something that will outlive us and keep making a difference in the world.
Like planting a seed that grows into a huge tree, giving shade and shelter to generations to come.
I love that. When we see generosity like that, it takes on a whole new meaning. It's not just about what we can get, it's about what we can give and what we leave behind.
It's about making a difference that'll last forever. And speaking of making a difference, one thing that really stood out to me in these sermons was the emphasis on risk. True generosity often means stepping out of our comfort zone.
Oh, definitely. When we give, we're letting go of something that we think of as ours, and we're trusting that God will take care of us. It takes faith.
And that's where real growth happens, right?
Mm.
When we decide to trust God, even when it feels scary.
Exactly. The Bible is full of stories about people who took risks for God. Just think of Abraham leaving his home, Moses confronting Pharaoh, David going up against Goliath. They all stepped out in faith, trusting that God would be with them.
And their obedience and generosity led to incredible breakthroughs and blessings. Not just for themselves, but for generations to come. Pretty inspiring, isn't it?
It is. It reminds us that real generosity isn't about playing it safe. It's about taking that leap of faith, trusting that God will catch us. It's about joining God in his amazing plan for the world.
Okay, so we've talked about risk, gratitude, stewardship, spiritual warfare, leaving a legacy. Clearly, Malachi 3:8-10 is about so much more than just money.
It's a call to look at every area of our lives and give our best to God, trusting that he'll bless us beyond measure.
It's a challenge to live a life that's radically generous. You know, to show God's abundance in everything we do, to trust that God will always provide for us. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a break and we'll come back for part 3. We'll get into even more practical ways to apply these ideas and how we can make them come alive in our ministries. Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive into Malachi 3:8-10. We've heard from 5 different churches, we've uncovered some really cool interpretations, and we even picked up some sermon illustrations along the way.
Yeah, and still, we always seem to come back to that same question, don't we? Will a mere mortal rob God? It's so simple, but it really gets to the heart of it all.
Right. It's definitely not a simple yes or no answer anymore, though.
Definitely not. It's not about checking things off a list.
Yeah.
It's about realizing that everything we have, our time, our skills, our very breath, comes from God. Holding back in any area is only cheating ourselves out of what he has for us.
That makes me think about impact, which came up a lot in these sermons. It wasn't just about personal blessings, but about actually making a difference in the world.
Yeah, you're right. When we give generously, we're investing in something way bigger than ourselves. It's about funding missions, supporting ministries, being a part of God's work in the world. It's about making a difference that lasts forever.
So it's not just about giving money, it's about being part of God's plan to save the world.
Exactly. And that brings us to worship. A lot of pastors pointed out that when we give, we're showing that God is in control of everything. It's not just about singing or raising our hands. It's about giving up our resources as a way of showing our love and devotion to God.
So from all these different viewpoints, what's the most important thing for pastors and Bible study leaders to remember when they teach about Malachi 3:8-10?
I think it's about digging deeper, going beyond the surface, and really wrestling with what this passage means. Don't just tell people to give more. Help them understand why. Help them see how their giving helps them grow spiritually, find freedom, discover their purpose, and even strengthen their relationships.
So it's about equipping people to really live out this radical generosity in a way that changes their lives and the world.
Exactly. It's not about guilt or obligation. It's about giving people the power to experience the joy and abundance that come from working with God.
And that brings us to our final thought for today.
Hmm.
If giving isn't just about money, but about showing our trust in God and joining Him in His work, how does that change our approach to giving and stewardship in all areas of our lives?
Right. That's the real question, isn't it? It's not just about money, it's about everything. Our time, talents, relationships, even our thoughts. What are we holding back? Where are we giving less than our best?
It's a challenge to look at every part of our lives and ask, am I really giving my all? Am I reflecting God's generosity in everything I do?
That's the journey, right? It's not about reaching some finish line. It's about constantly growing, surrendering, and changing. It's about becoming more and more like Jesus in every part of our lives.
That's a powerful way to wrap things up. This deep dive has been really eye-opening, and I hope it's giving you some new ideas about Malachi 3:8-10. Remember, it's not just about preaching a message. It's about empowering people to actually live it.
And as you do that, watch what God does. He loves to surprise and bless those who are willing to step out in faith and generosity.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep growing, and keep giving generously.